Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Security in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Dr. Suzanne Loftus. I'm pleased to have with us on the show today Nicholas Gvosdev. It's nice to have you with us today. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here, Suzanne.
Nicholas is a professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. He is also a member of our LOISAC group. LOISAC group is a collaboration between the Munich Security Conference and the Marshall Center and focuses on enhancing U.S. and German security cooperation and partnerships. So, Nicholas has written quite a few interesting articles recently, and I thought we could talk about them today. And the topics range from Russia and US national interests, as well as the coronavirus through a realist lens, and also on the global order and the shifts that are taking place today. So, Nicholas, if we could start, could you please tell us a little bit about the trends that are going on that explain this shift in global order? We see the Germans have called it the Zeitenwende. My pronunciation is probably terrible, but it means a turn in an era, a turn of an era in global politics. Could you explain to the audience a little bit what that means?
Sure. I think what we're seeing is in 2020, the end of several cycles in both international and domestic politics. The first is that we really are coming to the end of the post Cold War era that started the anniversary that we will celebrate next month, the 31st anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. That ushered in a new era, a post Cold War era. People have tried to date when that era has ended, and sometimes they say 2001 or 2008, 9/11, or the global financial crisis. But really, the idea that the United States kind of was setting a global agenda, that the world was moving towards greater economic integration, that the world was moving towards a more democratic world, the rise in the number of liberal free market democracies, that we were moving away from uh, major state on state confrontation. It used to be said in a post Cold War era, the danger are not from strong states, they're from weak states, and that we needed to work together to try to stabilize different parts of the world and prevent them from exporting their problems, whether it was terrorism or disease or economic instability into other parts of the world. We're now back in an era which is more familiar to students of history, which is great power competition. Major states seeking to establish or reestablish zones of privileged interest, seeking, if they can, to replicate the Congress of Vienna model of dividing up the world among the great powers. And if that's not possible, to compete, to reset or to change rules that we thought were set relatively in stone after 9/11. And so that's the first of these changes. The second has been we have reached an end to a period of economic integration, global integration that has taken place. And both economically and politically, different countries are taking stock. Uh, there have been winners and losers. What we have seen is that the quote unquote losers from economic globalization have been in the somewhat political ascendancy over the last number of years. And then the pandemic hits in 2020. And instead of this being a moment to celebrate coming together as an international community, the emphasis has been on isolating ourselves from the spread of the virus, concerns about supply chains, who are we dependent on for pharmaceuticals and protective equipment. And so we've reached again the end of this cycle of globalization is good, globalization is automatically the way forward, and we're seeing people return or re-examine questions of economic nationalism, re-examining the logic of long extended supply chains across borders. Certainly the idea that great power competition would be prevented, what was sometimes referred to as the great capitalist peace, which we were supposedly going to have from the late 90s onward, that if China and the United States and the European Union and Russia were all trading and doing business with each other, then conflict would be impossible. I think you have people now questioning those assumptions. Certainly in the United States, they're questioning the assumptions of the U.S.-China relationship of the economic integration. And then finally, the third piece of this Zeitenwende, as the Munich Security Conference describes it, an end of an era, is that we're coming to an end of political cycles in most of the advanced industrial democracies, but certainly in Europe and in the United States, where the established political parties and movements, to some extent, are running out of gas. They're running out of energy. They are not coming up with new ideas. The leaderships, in some cases, are elderly. The fact that the United States is having a presidential contest next month between two candidates in their late 70s is kind of an emblematic of this that we're not seeing. Or the generational change hasn't happened yet. And of course, what we've seen in Europe is established parties losing ground and new political movements emerging. And of course, Germany itself is also going to face a major leadership transition in the coming years. So I think all of these things, all of these factors are intersecting at this particular moment in time to create this sense of uncertainty about the future, and where familiar landmarks of the past may be washed away and replaced in the coming years.
Yeah, you really laid that out quite well and explained all the trends that are going on. It was quite remarkable and striking to see how each country responded to the coronavirus pandemic, and how perhaps in the past there would have been more cooperation or more leadership coming from the United States, or especially more cooperation between the United States and the European Union. It was really just a test of strength to see the relationship between everyone these days, and why, and to see how they would basically react to such an event. You also mentioned that there has been some losers in globalization who have now started to make their mark again, or who have started to rise in economic prowess, and that perhaps translates to more influence around the world as well. So there's quite a few different, let's say, trends again, as I mentioned. But the United States, however, is still the global superpower. It has the largest military, it has the largest economy in nominal terms. And so there's all this talk about how the US is waning and hegemony is waning. And we can clearly see that it's maybe happening in some ways, but it's not 100% established or determined that that's really what's going on. There's still debate about it. However, what I do notice, and what I'm sure the entire security community also sees, is a decline in the US's ability to compel or convince other major states in the international system to accept its preferences. Why do you think that that's going on? And how can we see that actually happening these days?
In part, that's because the situation that emerged after 1989 to 1991, to some extent, was artificial. That you had this very dramatic collapse of the Soviet Union, and then as the Soviet Union collapsed, and then you had a dramatic collapse of the economy in the Soviet Union's principal successor state, the Russian Federation. You had a European Union that had not yet come together. This is, the Treaty of Maastricht only comes into force in 1992, and the major boom for Europe isn't yet quite on the horizon. Germany is still trying to, at least in the initial years, deal with the costs of reunification. China was looking inward after Tiananmen Square. The major economic reforms in places like India and Brazil had not yet kicked in. And so the United States sort of sat, as it did after World War II in 1945, although not as dramatically in 1991, had an outsized amount of power and influence. And the problem is that the U.S. national security establishment, and more importantly, the political establishment, took the conditions of the 1990s as normative, that this is, in fact, how the world ought to operate, how it's going to operate. And as other powers revived, resurged, or emerged, so as Russia returned, as China continued its rise, as other regional players from Turkey to Indonesia to Brazil all began to uh, take more of a seat at the table. And you started this point with that very important reminder. The United States is still the largest power. It's not a decline in absolute terms. It's not as if the United States, it's not, and it's not zero sum. It's not as if the United States lost power and others took it. The United States still has a great deal of power, except its political system in national security terms has not been able to really make the jump effectively to how you navigate that, how you convince, persuade, use your tools of power in a system where other countries have themselves a greater preponderance of power. And if you're measuring things by the standard of, say, 1994, when the United States could go to the UN Security Council, it could get resolutions passed, it could unilaterally cut countries out of the global economy through the use of its sanctioning power, which the United States still has some degree of power to do, but lesser now that China's rise certainly has given people alternatives. But the United States isn't sure of how it's going to navigate this world, say, of the 2020s, where, for example, if we take developments in the Middle East, where in 1994 the United States was the only game in town. All roads ran to Washington, economically, politically, and security terms. In 2020, a Middle Eastern country that's on the outs with the United States, say Iran, it can be sanctioned by the US, but now there is a much larger China that is prepared to buy its oil, to do business with it. And in security terms, if you are a Middle Eastern country and the United States doesn't want to provide equipment or isn't going to be as active in conflict resolution, there is a pathway back to Moscow now.
Mm-hmm.
And so the United States is looking at this and kind of oscillating between a kind of, well, that's not fair. That shouldn't be that's not the way it's supposed to be, because it should be the world of 1994, where the United States can essentially set an agenda, or we talk about great power competition, and we talk about it in ways that make it sound like it is just going to be this kind of test of will, and the United States will sort of show resolve, and all of these things will somehow take care of themselves. Whereas other countries, particularly countries which see themselves at a disadvantage to the United States and a disadvantaged by the international order that the US created after the Cold War. So again, thinking here primarily of Russia and China, are preparing and have been competing with the United States and with the West more broadly along a whole spectrum, a whole range of tools of statecraft, and are actively engaged in it. They didn't wait for the United States to declare in the 2017, 2018 national security strategy and national defense strategy that we have entered a period of great power competition. They were already doing it. But we in the United States in particular, and then this also extends to our allies in Europe and to our allies in the Asia Pacific, have to begin thinking about what does it mean to compete in this type of environment. And I think we're still a bit behind the curve on that.
Yeah, so we're seeing just basically a rise of China, a rise of Russia, and two authoritarian states. So it's not the rise, let's say, of another similar type of democracy as the United States, and that also adds to the challenge that we're seeing today. And as you laid out, the U.S. national defense strategy and national security strategy changed its priorities to stating that it was a great power competition and the rise of revisionist powers, quote unquote, of Russia and China trying to change, destabilize, or U.S.-led international order. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about how the Russians and the Chinese are influencing this US-led national order. How can you describe their main areas of influence?
Well, I mean, each of them have different strengths. China's influence obviously comes from its enormous economic power, its financial reserves, its productive capacity, its willingness to put those, both the state companies, but even for private Chinese companies, to put those uh, resources to some extent at the service of the state in doing this. So China's ability to uh, export not just simply goods and services, but then to export them to countries in the service of large infrastructure projects, of being able to provide financing for development, to create new linkages so that countries that might have been overly dependent on trade, say with the United States or with Europe, now have new trade routes that link them to the growing dynamism, which is the Asia Pacific, Indo Asia Pacific basin. And that gives China influence because then countries again have a choice. Now, China's help may come with different sets of strings than those from the West, and those terms may be more hidden, but a number of countries have found uh, harnessing their own internal development to China's uh, motor is beneficial to them, and then that gains them influence. And we've seen this, of course, even in Europe itself, with the EU or the Europe 17 plus one dynamic with China. That even in Europe, the influence of the Chinese economy, the idea that this is a growing market, that there's money to be made, is pretty powerful. And then what is it that the Chinese ask for in return? They ask for first and foremost, they seem to ask for countries not necessarily to be their allies. They're not using it to buy allies. They're asking countries to sort of stay neutral in any conflict or disputes they have with the United States, and to be more supportive of Chinese efforts to revise elements of the international system in China's favor, either actively to support or, again, at best to be neutral. Right? Don't get involved. If the United States has a problem with China, it's not your business. Don't get involved. And this is, of course, is a pitch even to the Europeans, right? That if the United States has a problem with China in the Pacific Basin, it's not Europe's problem. Europe shouldn't need to get involved. Europe should stay on the sidelines. And so we've seen how China kind of uses its economic power as a way forward. Russia has a certain degree, smaller degree of economic power, primarily through its position as a supplier of energy and other raw materials. But Russia has other influences. It has an ability, just as the Chinese companies have this ability to put their productive capacity at the service of the Chinese state in extending Chinese influence abroad. The Russian establishment, its security establishment, can punch far above its expected weight. Uh, when Western analysts look at Russia and they say, well, how much power should Russia be able to project? Uh, Russia punches above that because it knows how to focus that power. Military power, certainly, its ability to sell arms, to gain influence in that way, its ability to insert itself as a mediator, as a third party to try to resolve disputes, its ability to take advantage of countries that have disputes with the United States or are feeling on the outs with Washington, and again, primarily through the provision of security assistance or military equipment to try to foster those divisions. Finally, Russia and now China is learning this as well, has been to wield the tools of sharp power. That Western societies, and particularly the United States, have deep domestic fissures. Those fissures are much more uh, accessible to outside actors to manipulate through social media, through other types of media engagement, and to use this as a way to get countries to turn inward. Certainly, to get the United States to be less involved in other parts of the world, if you can exacerbate or help fan discord within the U.S. or to create political problems within the U.S. But also, and this goes back to your point about the authoritarian challenge. And linking it back to the end of this political cycle that we've seen since the end of the Cold War, what I've been calling in this essay I did for Orbis for the fall issue of the journal Orbis, the end of the 30 years cycle, and that what we have is people even now questioning, and we've seen the polling data among younger generations questioning the efficacy of democracy. Right? Do liberal democracies actually deliver? Can they deliver economic security? Can they deliver economic growth? Can they deliver physical security? Can they deliver on promises of justice and equity and social development? And again, it's not that the Russians and the Chinese are saying adopt our system in particular, but they're getting people in the West to question whether or not the liberal democratic free market system that everyone said was ascendant after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that was, as in the famous article by Francis Fukuyama in the National Interest, that this in fact was the quote end of history. This was the point to which all societies in the world were evolving towards. And now to say, well, maybe that's not the case, and so both Russia and China are using their influence to some extent to get the Euro-Atlantic community to question its faith in itself and its ability to shape both their own societies as well as the international order.
Absolutely. You explained that so well. And we've seen, I'd say after the 2008 financial crisis is probably when it really began to manifest itself in the European and American societies, that there was this uneven economic recovery, and those that had felt the repercussions of the crisis much more started to question the efficacy of the European project, or of liberal democracy, or of the U.S.'s capacity to lead, and that just led into more challenges domestically, but also internationally. Some of the actions of the United States in the Middle East, or interventionist policies in Libya, for example, have all kind of turned out negatively, and it's a way for other powers to come in and point out the flaws of the U.S.-led liberal international order and the flaws of liberal democracy within the structures themselves. So also a lot of this information warfare is about immigration policy, for example, how liberal democracies are too liberal with their immigration policy, and that is affecting national identity inside the various nations, and affecting the indigenous laborer, and kind of displacing them, and just really reinforcing all the existing rifts in society. So they've definitely managed to capitalize on that. And then after the Russian invasion of Crimea, the United States and its European allies placed some sanctions on Russia. And as we saw, this, first of all, has not changed Russia's behavior, but has pushed it closer to China. And now Russia and China have a stronger, or closer rather, relationship to one another, both in terms of trade, and they were doing some military exercises together at some point. How do you see the Russia-China relationship evolving and developing? And should the West try to work together to discourage further Russia-China convergence?
Yeah, well, this is, I think, the critical question that we're facing as we move through the 2020s and beyond, which is for years, people were warning that we were seeing a trend towards, whether you called it a strategic partnership or an entente or something where Russia and China were aligning more with each other. There was always going to be some degree of Russia-China connection. It makes geopolitical sense, economic sense, but the what we would always hoped is that Russia and China would always balance their relationship with each other, with their relations with the United States, with the European Union, and with the major states of Europe in particular. What we have seen, as you have pointed out, partly by Russia's own actions and its choices that it has made, but also by how the West has been uh, responding, is that we are creating incentives for Russia and China to move closer together. Uh, I think we have too much faith in the idea that ultimately Russia and China's interests may diverge, and that all we need to do is simply wait for that inevitable disagreement to happen. I don't think it's good security policy to base your actions on your expected, Russia-China war of 2054. That somehow Russia and China will inevitably have a split, and therefore we don't need to worry about this because between now and say 2054, Russia and China together can do a lot of things uh, in their interests that will be problematic for what the United States and what the other members of NATO and the European Union would like to see happen in the world. We're already seeing this is that for years Russia resisted selling some of its most advanced military equipment to China. That has changed, and China is able now to purchase and therefore reverse engineer a much greater amount of advanced Russian military technology, which therefore increases Chinese capabilities. As Chinese capabilities increase, the United States must pivot more into the Indo-Asia Pacific to counter that. As the United States pivots to the Indo-Asia Pacific, the question about what happens to Europe. Do Europeans pick up more of the slack for the defense of the continent and indeed the defense of the Atlantic basin? What happens? So already you can see that convergence between Russia and China over the last several years creates problems in the Euro-Atlantic relationship because European partners are now very well aware, I think, that United States may find itself committed long term to something happening in the Pacific Basin, which will disconnect the United States from Europe, or at least lessen those ties. And then, of course, for Europeans, the choice is at what point are certain Russian demands for revision likely to be acceptable, right? And this is the problem of the geographic split within Europe. What I've always have always found is the farther west and south you go in Europe, the less appetite there is for confrontation with Russia. The more a sense of, well, we can reach some sort of accommodation, we can make some adjustments to the post Cold War settlement. Obviously, the further east you go in Europe, and to an extent, the further north and east you go into the Arctic, you may find European partners that are a little more concerned about giving ground to the Russians. The question is the Chinese relationship giving Russia some degree of confidence that it can continue to pursue these policies, that if Russia had to, on its own, come to terms with its major European partners, would it be more accommodating? Again, I think some of the evidence shows that this Russia-China partnership is what enables China to project out into the south and into South Asia and then into the Pacific, knowing that its kind of Eurasian backyard is relatively quiet. And then, of course, for Russia, the sense that it can project into the Middle East and into Europe because it does not need to be as concerned about its eastern borders, and then that there is some degree of economic partnership between the two. And then, of course, the moves on currency are very interesting. At some point, will Russia and China continue to stop or decrease the amount of dollars that they use? And then, of course, that has ramifications for the United States. If the dollar begins to diminish as a global reserve currency, then the interests of countries, including China's current interests in keeping the value of the dollar stable, also diminish. So all of these things, we can't point to something and say in 2021, this is the one dramatic event. But we're looking at trends. And then slowly there's an evolution. And so suddenly in 2030 or 2035, we look and we suddenly see, wow, the world has really changed. And how did that happen over a period of a decade or more? But we're already seeing over the last several years the impact of that change. Should we in the West be try to encourage. I mean, that's always been a staple of Western policy. Not that we're going to pry Russia and China and to get them to fight each other, but we've always wanted them to have a certain degree of distance. To see, we want them to see their relations with each other in the light of their relations with Brussels and Berlin and London and Paris and Washington, and to counterbalance that. But right now, the Russian sense is, I think that. As long as they have this relationship with Beijing, they can begin to wait out, particularly their European partners, and that they can maybe again continue to push for revision.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking more closely at the Russian-Western relationship, since the fall of the Soviet Union, in the beginning, we saw that maybe there would be some possibility for Russia to try and join the West, and they seemed a bit more open to collaborating and to democratizing. But then we saw this sudden shift in Russian domestic politics, and then in Russian foreign politics to kind of reassert itself and reassert its interests globally, vis-a-vis the United States, especially standing up for its interests and not abiding by the US-led international system. I wonder, where did we go wrong as the West? I mean, was there more that we could have done? Could we have prevented what happened in Crimea and Ukraine? I mean, where is it that the Russians and the Western nations really just lost, their relationship and their potential to collaborate?
Yeah, on the one hand, I'm always cautious about the term, framing it as a who lost whom question, because it takes away the question of agency. That the Russian state has made decisions. Hasn't just simply been, well, the West did this, and then Russia had no choice but to do something else. But the problem, I think, is what I have sometimes referred to as the triple deception after the end of the Cold War. And this was that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian core of the Soviet Union emerges. It is definitely weakened. It is down. It's not completely out, and it has a number of potentialities for resuming a degree of power in the international system. That wasn't going to be clear for anyone who visited, Russia between 1991 and 1993 or 1994. You really saw a society that was still in the dealing with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then later in the 1990s, the financial collapse within the Russian Federation. And you looked at that and kind of said, well, maybe um, this is not going to, Russia isn't really going to project power. That, I think, that's where the mistake was. The mistake was, for Russia, there's only two futures: either it will integrate with the West, or it will disappear as a great power. Those were the two options we always heard in the 1990s. Either Russia will be it'll be a weakened state that'll then be brought into the European Union and NATO. It'll essentially be a supplicant saying, look, we want to be a part of Europe and NATO because we've got nothing and we need to come in, and therefore we're going to do the same types of changes, uh, Copenhagen criteria, the conditionalities, all of that, in order to get into the Euro-Atlantic club. Or that it wouldn't matter because Russia would be finished as a major power. And we wouldn't have to worry about it. So even if a Russian government objected strenuously to NATO enlargement or uh, other policies, it just wouldn't matter. Option three, that Russia would resurge as a major power, wasn't considered. So because we didn't consider it, we didn't think about it, we didn't prepare eventualities for it, both positive and negative, both accommodationist as well as being prepared for the possibility of competition in a more adversarial sense. So I think intellectually we failed in that regard. The triple deception comes in this way, though, as well, which is, as we in the West conceive, and specifically here of the major Western European powers in the United States, that after 1991, we look at the former Soviet space, we look at the former Warsaw Pact, and we look at our own domestic societies, and we essentially pursued a series of actions where we hoped that we would never be, as in essence, called to cash any checks. So what you have is uh, the use of enlargement as a tool to encourage reformers in Central East Europe. Continue down these paths of reform, and we will bring you into NATO. We will then bring you into the European Union, regardless of any relationship with Russia, whether the Russians are going to do it or not. Uh, European publics were essentially told, don't worry about any of this. And this goes back to your earlier point about the after the financial crisis, the sense that the European project is failing. When enlargement was being discussed in the 90s, it was all about enlargement as a benefit. It's essentially going to be cost free, both NATO enlargement and European Union enlargement. You're not really going to see much of a burden. And so why not enlarge as far as and as quickly as we can enlarge? Uh, Particularly with NATO, the problem there was we can continue to enlarge NATO, but no one has to. No one in Europe, at least, needs to increase any defense spending or change capabilities because we're enlarging NATO. We're giving these security guarantees to countries that are asking for them, but we don't believe that we'll ever be asked to actually enforce those security guarantees. And in the United States, the deception was this was sold to the U.S. public, particularly about NATO enlargement, as means more partners, which means more burden sharing, which means that the share that the United States has to pay for NATO should go down because as NATO grows, more members, and therefore, and again, also this idea that we can enlarge the alliance without really having to worry about any checks to be paid. The problem is geography is a harsh mistress in Europe, particularly when it comes to security, particularly when it comes to major advances over the last 20 years in what we call anti-access area denial technologies. That geography in Europe creates zero-sum security dilemmas. If I move a system, an air defense system, further in your direction, by definition, I can now project a bubble that may intersect with your territory. In turn, if you move things to your borders, you now have the ability to project and have that anti-area access denial bubble pushed out over my territory. And so the problem that we have seen that NATO is still wrestling with is that when it comes to Romania, Poland, the Baltic states, when we talk about cooperation with Georgia or Ukraine, is that it becomes zero sum. If we move people into the Baltic states, the Russian general staff starts worrying about vulnerabilities. If we say we're not going to move anyone to the Baltic states, the Baltic allies get worried because then they don't feel that they're secure. And so we haven't worked out. Again, this is part of this issue of thinking through great power competition. We haven't worked out how we assure allies without necessarily with the Russians creating a situation where we're going to spiral towards conflict. And the two solutions of the 1990s are not on the table. Solution one, which was this will all solve itself because when Russia itself becomes a member of NATO and the European Union, it won't matter because Germany, Poland, Russia will all be together at the same table. That's not going to happen. For the same reason, it's not going to happen for Turkey and the European Union, which has been one of those seams Russia has exploited as well. The other one, even with the oil crisis and economic crisis and COVID, I think we have people that still look at every moment are just waiting for this problem to solve itself by Russia collapse, right? The Russians will just collapse and then this will cease to be a problem because Russia will have disappeared as a great power. Again, Russia's got a brittle political system. It's got some real economic issues. But again, waiting for Russia to collapse as your security strategy for Europe, I don't think is quite advisable. So then again, it's how do you manage competition with a major power that has real capabilities and has shown in Syria and in Ukraine in particular, as you noted, a willingness to use those capabilities. And that's what we have to be thinking about moving forward.
Mhm. Yeah, I definitely wouldn't rely on the Russia collapse. They seem to be quite resilient. If you look throughout history, there's always coming back from the ashes every time, and finding ways to survive. You know, even post sanctions, with import substitution and diversifying trading partners, using their rainy day funds. I mean, it's like they always have something, that they use to be able to survive and get out of their mess. Um, so, in this podcast series, I like to ask each of the interviewees specific questions about great power competition, the transatlantic relationship, and disinformation campaigns, and tailor these questions to what they've written recently, for example, or what they do for a living. So I thought that in terms of the great power competition and transatlantic relationship question, we could tailor that in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, because I saw that you recently published something about that was quite interesting. So, in your opinion, how has the pandemic exacerbated both great power competition and current existing transatlantic tensions?
Yeah. Well, the thing with the pandemic, which is quite interesting, is that all of the major powers see the pandemic not as a moment to say we must stop competing for a while and all come together to face what is undoubtedly a common challenge, right? No part of the world, no country is immune from this. No country has not had loss from the pandemic, but the attitude has been we may take losses, but our competitors will be hurt even worse. So why cooperate with our competitors and essentially throw them the life preserver of cooperation if we think that they're going to be struggling? And so we've seen this in how uh, different countries have said we're going to hoard equipment, we're not going to work together on a vaccine, or we will have competing vaccines. Uh, we will have competing treatments. No, the proposals at the G20 for, hey, let's kind of set aside some of the disputes and conflicts around the world. And, the United States says, we're not lifting sanctions on Iran, India and China. Karabakh has just exploded, even though both Armenia and Azerbaijan are coping with coronavirus spikes and second waves and the like. But it's this idea that the virus is going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt me. And therefore, I am not incentivized to cooperate with you. And in fact, if I can make your recovery from the virus more difficult, then that's the kind of policies that I'm going to pursue. And so all this talk that, Bill Gates was waxing eloquently in March about coronavirus could be equivalent to World War II. It will put together a grand coalition of states to work together. Instead, it has been pretty much every state or every group of states for itself, and not coming together to cooperate and to work together, but instead to see this as a way to get ahead. With the transatlantic relationship, we are missing an opportunity. Perhaps this may, belatedly, we may pick this up, but the idea that the transatlantic relationship could have been a basis for saying we're not just talking about military security of alliance members, but health security of citizens, right? That we want to imagine or to start thinking about NATO not just as numbers of tanks that you can put into the field, but cooperation among allies and partners to redefine or expand the definition of collective security so that things like health security fall into this. What we saw instead was that NATO allies, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, were more likely to be competing against each other for personal protective equipment and pharmaceuticals than they would be helping each other. And that, I think, damaged the credibility of NATO among some of the populations. But NATO in turn also has a longer term issue that you have publics in all of the NATO countries. They're all broadly supportive of the idea, but then you begin to drill down and say, well, what does this mean to you in your day-to-day life? And there's a disconnect. Well, why does the alliance matter? And if we could reconfigure or think about the alliance beyond just simply this is going to be defense against a revisionist Russia, which and certainly in some countries in Europe that is definitely a priority. But to say to publics, and this is something that in the Doorstep podcast, in the first edition of the Doorstep podcast, which launched this month, was to look at people's concerns. They're worried about health security. They're worried about information security. And you have a pool of countries in the NATO alliance that could be doing a lot more on information security, 5 to 6G networks, pandemic protection, health security, and that all of these could create a basis for public and popular support for regenerating the transatlantic tie, because that tie right now is frayed, not just simply because of political leaders, although we can assign some blame to who sits in the White House and in other places, but the idea, too, that a simple change of administration in the U.S. fixes this, it doesn't. You need to reimagine the alliance. And I think we have to the pandemic has given us an opportunity. We haven't taken it yet, but the pandemic is still ongoing as a way to reimagine the transatlantic relationship in favor of not just military security, but things like health security and information security as a way to get the populations of the alliance more invested in its continuation.
Absolutely. I mean, it's 2020. This alliance and the relationship has been ongoing for 70 years or plus, and threats have changed. The world has evolved. The geopolitics has changed. Perhaps we just need to, as you said, sort of take a look at the alliance system and kind of adapt it to modern day challenges, and also try to re-educate the younger generation about why the alliance is important, why the relationship is important. And one of the best ways to do that is to adapt it to what's going on today. So as you said, health crises, for example, it really does provide an opportunity for NATO and for the relationship at large to collaborate on more modern day, let's say, challenges going on. So as you said, the pandemic really just kind of underscored and highlighted the problematic areas and where we need to kind of focus on to improve and to achieve a more collaborative future between the alliance. And then lastly, but definitely not least, I wanted to ask you about disinformation campaigns. So we've been hearing a lot about these, especially during the pandemic. Actually, we've had a lot of disinformation coming from all parts of the world about who started it, and who's the leader in the world, who's helping people the most, who's not, and a lot of distorted information floating around. So the pandemic has highlighted that, but it's definitely not been just as a result of this pandemic. We've been seeing disinformation campaigns for years. It's nothing new. But what are the effects likely to be in this current Zeitenwende, as we said in the first question? And what advice would you have for the West in particular to counter these threats?
I think one of the things that's changing with these types of campaigns is that they're moving away from propaganda towards a type of moral and relativistic nihilism. And what I mean by that was it used to be that propaganda and information campaigns still had the idea that there was a truth out there that I wanted to convince you of. I might lie about that truth. I might make things up. I might have a Potemkin village, but I was still trying to convince you that my perspective or my way or my solution was better, or that yours was worse. And so when you used to have, say Soviet propaganda campaigns, it would be about, you know, the United States is a threat to peace, and here are the military spending things, or the Soviet Union has a better healthcare system because primary care is free for everyone. And so there was the sense of, we're trying to convince you uh, that your position is wrong or our position is right. What we're seeing now increasingly with these disinformation campaigns is they're not designed really to convince you of anything. They're not designed to get you to say, "Huh, I was wrong about that idea or perspective, and I should change my thinking." Instead, they're designed to get you to question the idea that we really know anything? Is there anything such as objective reality? In the sense that, well, when I turn on the news and I see something, I see an event in Syria, I see an event in Nagorno Karabakh, I see an event in Italy, I see protests that are happening. Do I accept that and say this is a slice of reality, or do I just say, well, all of it is fake, all of it is fake, all of it is manufactured. We can't know what happened with anything. Um, Airliners get shot down. Well, who knows how they got shot down? People get sick. They get poisoned. Who knows how that happened? Who can tell? And what you're seeing with these newer propaganda campaigns is getting people to question. And this goes back to the foundation, as you were mentioning earlier, Suzanne, about liberal democracies and about how they operate. This is getting people to question things such as that, well, I can know about what's happening, I can play a role in government, or that I can trust my government, I can trust the media sources of my country, I can trust the institutions. And when you get that more approach of a sharp power, which is designed to atomize and divide societies, the goal is not, again, the goal is not uh, to get people to say, we're going to remodel our society on Russian or Chinese lines. The goal is for societies to say, we've got so much internal discord, we're just not going to be able to project or interfere or get involved in other parts of the world. And so we're seeing that with these campaigns of, getting you to question whether or not everyone lies. I mean, that's really what you've been seeing over the last number of years. It's not a question of, in 1980, Radio Moscow would tell you, the New York Times lies, but we're telling you the truth. Today, the propaganda disinformation campaigns are, everyone lies, everyone is shading the truth. There is nothing objective, and therefore you can't take any of it seriously. And if you can't, and also therefore you shouldn't be prepared to support any claims. Uh, well, the airliner gets shot down in Ukraine. Well, if you can't know how that airliner got shot down, well, should we really impose sanctions? Should we really increase defense spending? Alexei Navalny comes to Berlin. Well, should we really have sanctions? How can we know what happened to him, really? Maybe he poisoned himself. Maybe he had an allergic reaction. Maybe he was fine, and then he arrived in Berlin and they injected him with something. You could see where this goes, right? That this now is about getting people to go for inaction, not taking action, not being engaged. What are the responses to it? I mean, again, some of this is personal responsibility and collective responsibility in the West. My colleague Tom Nichols had a very interesting suggestion when Politico asked about changes you would like to recommend. He said, we have too much free internet time. People spend too much time online because they're not paying for it as they used to when we used to have famous dial-up services of the 90s, which is when you wanted to go online, you were paying for it. And therefore, you had to be very judicious about your use. Today, people can spend their time sharing things, not, well, my friend sent me this interesting thing on Facebook and it's really fascinating, and I'm going to spend a lot of time delving down into this. We have to break people out of the conspiracy mindsets that, the truth is out there. And that I am now, we see with a lot of these disinformation campaigns is they're designed to prey on people's sense that things are being hidden from them. Media companies need to take up their share of the responsibility. the internet providers for not just simply saying, well, we're just a pass through. We have no responsibility for things that are on our sites. And media organizations need to take more responsibility for their failings. And that includes how they report, their willingness, either through ignorance or through deliberate choice, to not always report all sides of a story, if particularly if they find that to be inconvenient. I'm personally very distressed by things I've seen come out of the New York Times Guild, where with journalists essentially seeming to have this position that if the story that I'm covering causes me psychic harm, I don't want it to be reported. Well, you're creating conditions then where someone says, well, obviously we're not getting the full story, and therefore someone comes up and says, but see, I went to this source and it's telling you the real story. And that's how disinformation grows. As you've pointed out, we've always had it. Why was this not effective in 1980 or 1990? Why was Soviet disinformation better funded in many ways than current Russian efforts, which are really shoestring efforts? Why were they less effective? And partly because we had a more resilient media ecosystem in the West, and people took those responsibilities, and both individuals as news consumers, and then the organizations delivering the news and providing the content. This goes back to this kind of laissez-faire attitude of, well, we'll just let the market decide, and we're all in an international media environment, and somehow the truth will win out. But the truth doesn't usually win out unless it's very, very careful. And what we've seen over the last number of years is that simply relying on the idea that the truth will prevail is a very, again, like waiting for Russia to collapse, is a very risky strategy to take when you're engaged in an information struggle, information great power competition.
For sure. I mean, this era is really just dangerous with the way that propaganda is being disseminated. As you said, it's not my truth versus their truth. It's just making everyone question everything they hear, and as being just false by nature because it's been fabricated by someone or someone else, that we don't know what to believe anymore. And that's the most dangerous and challenging of all types of propaganda and info wars. And I wrote something actually about this post-truth environment, which is basically what we're talking about here in the context of coronavirus. And although there's so many, campaigns out there, spreading false information about the virus, in a way, there is a truth that emerged. We can see with numbers, hard numbers, the way that societies and leaders have dealt with the pandemic, and how some societies were better able to deal with it than others. And it was due to the fact that they listened to scientific advice and they practiced the correct hygiene and mask wearing and social distancing and hospital care. And you can see that with your own eyes, and there's proof to that. And so perhaps the way that we can start kind of showing truth again is to just make what is real kind of more apparent to the eyes of the viewers on TV. And this has a lot to do with how media is portrayed too, though. And media has a long way to go because, as you said, sometimes you watch, CNN or New York Times or Fox, and you're like, oh, wow, it's really just very biased to one side, or just trying to be as sensationalist as possible and not capturing the whole truth. So we have a long way to go. But Nicholas, thank you so much for your time and for
Thank you,
being here
Suzanne.
today. I had a really great time. It was an interesting conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for tuning back in to Security in the 21st Century. And make sure to stay tuned for the next episode.